In this video, we want to look at the three phases of Jesus' existence as described by the Bible. The first phase is here in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Paul says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God." This is the first phase of Jesus' existence. He's in the form of God. But in verse 7, Paul says, "But made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant." So here we have in contrast, he was in the form of God, then he takes on the form of a servant. Whatever these mean, they are obviously placed here in contrast. And so when he's in the form of God, he's not in the form of a servant. What kind of servant are we talking about? Not the servant of man or the servant of the angels. He's a servant here of God, because in verse 8 it says that he's obedient unto death, and that was obedience to the Father. So here we find that before Jesus is the form of a servant, he's in the form of God, which implies that he was not a servant to God in that first phase. In other words, Jesus was not under obligatory obedience to God in phase 1. This is something that takes place when he becomes in the form of a servant. However, notice this. In the form of a servant, that is something he voluntarily does. Verse 7 says, "But he made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant." Again, implying this was voluntary. This was not of obligation. It was not that he had to do this. He chose to make himself of no reputation. He chose to take on him the form of a servant. Meaning that when Paul says in the verse 6 that he thought it not robbery to be equal with God, at least one sense in which he is equal with God is that he's equal with God in authority. He's equal with God in not having to obey obligatorily the commands of God. He is equal with God. This makes perfect harmony. This is in perfect harmony, rather, with what we saw in Genesis when we looked at the woman and the man. In Genesis 3, it says that the curse, a part of the curse, was that the woman's desire would be to her husband and he would rule over her. That implies that before this, he did not rule over her. Yes, I acknowledge that Adam was primary and that God speaks to him, that Eve was made after him and for him and all of that. But whatever that indicates, he was not ruling over her because that's a part of the curse. And so we find here that, again, Eve, like Jesus, was not under obligatory obedience to Adam when they were made in the image of God. And so with Jesus, we see the first phase of his existence is being in the form of God, above all obligatory obedience. Then he voluntarily takes on him the form of a servant and is made in the likeness of men. This harmonizes with what John said. John says in the beginning, he's the Word. He was with God. He was God. He referring to that angel of the Lord existence that we saw from before. But then he's made flesh. In verse 14 of John chapter 1, that's corresponding to when he's made in the likeness of men, a transition point between phase 1 and phase 2. This transition between phase 1 and phase 2 is also stated in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 2 verse 9 says that Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. He, of course, was above them before this took place. He was above all. He was the Lord himself, but he was made a little lower than the angels when he was made flesh and dwelt among us, because flesh in Psalms chapter 8, men are a little lower than the angels. So again, we see this switching, this transition from phase 1 to phase 2 when it takes on him the form of a servant and is made in the likeness of men. However, there's a third phase to Jesus' existence. In verse 9 of Philippians 2, Paul says, "Wherefore God also has highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name." So now we see him going back up. And Paul uses this term, given him a name which is above every name. Now, of course, his name was above every name in Exodus 23 when God says to the angel that my name is in him. That the name is the name of God. And so in Jesus' phase 1 existence, of course, his name was above every name. But when Jesus in Philippians 2 verse 7 made himself of no reputation, Now his name is not above all names. He goes from phase 1 to phase 2, and then in phase 3, he's highly exalted and given a name which is above every name. This is also echoed in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 4 says, being made so much better than the angels. Well, of course, the captain of the host of the Lord is better than the angels, but that was phase 1. In phase 2, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. And so that's why he now must transition to, again, be made much better than the angels, as he, by inheritance, has obtained a more excellent name than they. Again, speaking of this name that he has, that is above all names. So again, we see this transition from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. In phase 2, Jesus makes many statements. When he's in the form of a servant, he makes many statements that seem confusing when we think of his phase 1 existence. He says, my Father is greater than I. But of course, in the form of a servant, Jesus can say that. He says that I can of mine own self do nothing. Of course, in the form of a servant, he can say that. In phase 2 also, he makes this statement that helps us understand these. In John 17, verse 5, he says to the Father, glorify me with the glory which I had with thee before the world began. Again, he's referring to the phase 1. Before the world began, when I was in phase 1, I had a glory with you, Father, that I don't have here in phase 2. In phase 2, I'm in the form of a servant. In phase 2, the Father is greater than I. In phase 2, I can of mine own self do nothing. In phase 2, Jesus has a different sphere of existence. But then he transitions into phase 3. And what we must be careful to not do is to not apply his statements when he's in the form of a servant to the statement, to his existence when he is in the form of above all servants, of above all servanthood, and when he has the name above all names.